The afternoon sun beat mercilessly down on the wooden platform of Dust Hollow Station as the locomotive's whistle faded into the endless Arizona sky. Eleanor Whitmore stepped carefully from the passenger car, her worn leather boots touching the splintered planks with uncertainty. In her trembling hands, she clutched a single carpet bag and a creased envelope containing the marriage proposal that had brought her to this godforsaken corner of the territory. The train lurched forward with a grinding of metal and steam, carrying away her last connection to the civilized world she'd known. Eleanor stood alone on the platform, her simple blue traveling dress already gathering the fine desert dust that seemed to coat everything in this place. She had sewn the dress herself back in Philadelphia, choosing modest cotton over silk, knowing that frontier life would demand practicality over beauty. Around her waist, she wore a thin leather belt that held her few remaining coins, enough for perhaps 3 meals, if she was careful. The station master, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained whiskers, emerged from the tiny depot building. His eyes swept over Eleanor with the practiced assessment of someone who had seen too many hopeful souls arrive in Dust Hollow, only to leave broken or not at all. "You the bride for Samuel Morrison?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of already knowing the answer would disappoint them both. Eleanor's heart fluttered like a trapped bird. "Yes, sir. I am Eleanor Whitmore. Mr. Morrison was to meet me here at 4 o'clock. She glanced at the small silver watch pinned to her bodice, a gift from her late mother and one of the few valuable things she owned. The hands showed 4:30. The station master spat into the dust. "Morrison ain't comin'. Miss heard tell he took up with a saloon girl in Tucson 3 weeks back. Married her quick and headed south toward Mexico with what was left of his mining stake." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face as the desert heat suddenly seemed to press against her from all sides. But he sent for me. We corresponded for months. He promised. Promises don't mean much out here. Miss, a man's only as good as his word in the moment he gives it." The station master's weathered face showed a flicker of sympathy. "You got family back east? Money for a return ticket?" Eleanor shook her head, unable to trust her voice. The truth was too humiliating to speak aloud, that she had spent her last dollars on this journey, burning her bridges with the family who had disowned her for choosing such a desperate path. Her father's final words still rang in her ears. "No respectable woman becomes a mail-order bride. If you leave this house, Eleanor, don't expect to return." Word of the abandoned bride spread through Dust Hollow faster than wildfire. By evening, Eleanor found herself the object of curious stares and whispered conversations. She sat on a wooden crate outside the depot, her carpetbag at her feet, watching as the sun painted the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson. A small group of townswomen approached, their faces a mixture of pity and judgment. The leader was Mrs. Abernathy, wife of the general store owner, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch the disapproval across her features. "Miss Whitmore." "Mrs." Abernathy said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the moral compass of a frontier town. "It's not proper for a young woman to be sitting here unaccompanied. What exactly do you intend to do?" Eleanor rose to her feet, trying to maintain what dignity she had left. "I'm not sure yet, ma'am. Perhaps I could find work." "Work, Mrs." Abernathy exchanged glances with her companions. "What sort of work could you do? This isn't Philadelphia, child. We don't need seamstresses or piano teachers here. I can cook, clean, take care of children. The decent families already have help they trust." Another woman interjected. "And the indecent ones, well, no Christian woman should be associated with such establishments." As darkness began to settle over the town, Eleanor found herself with nowhere to go. The small boarding house refused her custom when they learned she couldn't pay in advance. The hotel was full, though she suspected that had more to do with her circumstances than actual capacity. Even the church was locked, with no sign of when services might be held. Finally, she gathered her courage and approached the warehouse district on the edge of town. Here, among the stacks of mining equipment and grain sacks. She might find shelter from the desert cold that she'd been warned would follow the blazing heat of the day. The night air cut through her thin dress like a blade. Eleanor huddled between two large crates, using her carpetbag as a pillow and her shawl as a blanket. The wind howled across the desert, carrying with it the fine sand that found its way into her eyes, her mouth, her very soul. She had never felt so alone, so utterly cast adrift from everything she had once called home. It was then that she heard the soft sound, barely more than a whisper against the wind, a rustling near the warehouse loading dock, followed by the creak of old wood. Eleanor peered through the darkness and saw a small figure moving stealthily between the shadows. A child, no more than 8 or 9 years old, thin as a reed and dressed in clothes that were more patches than original fabric. The boy was attempting to pry open a crate marked with the stamp of the general store. His small hand struggled with the wooden slats, and Eleanor could hear his labored breathing even from her hiding spot. When he finally managed to extract something from the crate, what looked like a piece of hardtack or dried bread, a larger shadow emerged from behind the warehouse. "Hey, you little thief!" The voice belonged to Jake Peterson, the store's clerk, a man known for his quick temper and quicker fists. He lunged forward, grabbing the child by the arm and lifting him clear off the ground. The boy cried out in pain and fear, dropping the bread into the dust. Peterson raised his free hand, ready to strike, when Eleanor found herself moving without conscious thought. "Stop!" she called out, rushing forward. "He's just a child." Peterson turned, his face ugly with anger. "Mind your own business, woman. This little savage has been stealing from decent folks for weeks." Eleanor could see the boy clearly now in the moonlight. His skin was sun-darkened, his black hair long and unkempt, his eyes wide with terror. The realization hit her like a revelation. This was an Apache child, one of the native people who were both feared and despised by the white settlers of the territory. "He's hungry," Eleanor said, moving closer despite Peterson's threatening posture. "Can't you see that? I can see he's a thieving redskin who needs to learn his place," Peterson snarled, shaking the boy roughly. "And I can see you're that fool bride who got herself abandoned. Birds of a feather, I'd say." The insult stung, but Eleanor forced herself to focus on the terrified child. "Please, let him go. I'll pay for whatever he took." Peterson laughed harshly. "With what? Everyone knows you ain't got 2 cents to rub together." He raised his hand again, but this time Eleanor stepped directly between him and the boy. The blow caught her across the shoulder, sending her stumbling backward. Pain shot through her body, but she managed to maintain her footing and keep herself between Peterson and the child. The man cursed and raised his hand again, but seemed to think better of it when he noticed other figures emerging from the shadows, drawn by the commotion. "This ain't over," Peterson muttered, then stalked away into the darkness, leaving Eleanor and the boy alone. Eleanor turned to the child, who was staring up at her with a mixture of wonder and wariness. She could see that he was trembling, whether from cold or fear she couldn't tell, perhaps both. "Are you hurt?" she asked gently, kneeling to his level. The boy shook his head, then surprised her by speaking in heavily accented English. "You, help me? Why?" Eleanor looked into his dark eyes and saw something she recognized, the same desperate loneliness that had been gnawing at her own heart. 2 outcasts, both unwanted by the world around them. "Because you needed help," she said simply. "What's your name?" "I am William," he said carefully, as if the English name sat uncomfortably on his tongue. Eleanor reached into her carpetbag and pulled out a small piece of jerked beef she had saved from the train journey. She offered it to the boy, who took it with careful reverence, as if it were made of gold rather than dried meat. As the night grew colder, Eleanor made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She opened her shawl and gestured for the boy to come closer. He hesitated for a long moment, then crept forward and allowed her to wrap the shawl around them both. They sat together in the cold desert night, 2 souls abandoned by their respective worlds, finding warmth in each other's presence The boy gradually relaxed against her side, and just before he fell asleep, he whispered something that made Eleanor's heart break and heal all at once. "Will you hold me until the night ends?" Eleanor tightened her arms around the small, fragile form and whispered back, "Yes, child, I will." Above them, the desert stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the pain and hope of the two forgotten souls huddled together against the darkness. But for Eleanor Whitmore, abandoned bride and unexpected guardian, those stars no longer seemed quite so cold. In protecting this child, she had found something she hadn't even known she was searching for, a purpose beyond her own survival, a reason to face whatever tomorrow might bring to the unforgiving frontier town of Dust Hollow. Dawn broke harsh and unforgiving over Dust Hollow, painting the desert landscape in shades of rust and gold. Eleanor stirred awake to find young William already alert beside her, his dark eyes scanning the horizon with the wariness of a creature long accustomed to danger. The shared warmth of the night had given way to the morning chill, and Eleanor's bones ached from sleeping on the hard ground between the warehouse crates. "Good morning," she whispered, not wanting to startle him. The boy turned to her, and for the first time, she saw something like trust flicker in his expression. "Morning, Lady Eleanor," he said carefully, testing out her name as he had the English words the night before. Eleanor's heart clenched at the formal politeness in his young voice. She reached into her carpet bag and withdrew the last of her hardtack, breaking it carefully in half. "Are you hungry?" William nodded eagerly, accepting his portion with both hands as if it were a precious gift. Eleanor watched him eat, noting how he made each small bite last, savoring what might be his only meal of the day. The sight filled her with a fierce protectiveness she had never experienced before. Their quiet morning was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Mrs. Abernathy appeared around the corner of the warehouse, flanked by two other women Eleanor recognized from the previous evening. The older woman's face was set in lines of moral disapproval that seemed permanently etched into her features. "Miss Whitmore, Mrs." Abernathy announced, her voice carrying across the still morning air like a judgment. "I see you've taken up with one of the local native children. Surely you understand how inappropriate this appears?" Eleanor rose to her feet, unconsciously placing herself between William and the approaching women. The child needed help. "Mrs. Abernathy." He was cold and hungry. "That child," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice dripping with disdain, "is one of the Apache strays that wander into town looking for trouble. They steal, they carry disease, and they're dangerous. No decent woman would associate with such creatures." Eleanor felt her temper flare, but she kept her voice steady. "He's a little boy, Mrs. Abernathy. A hungry, frightened little boy." "He's a savage," interjected Mrs. Henderson, the blacksmith's wife, her ample form quivering with indignation. "And you, Miss Whitmore, are already the subject of enough gossip without adding consorting with natives to your list of improprieties." The third woman, Mrs. Cole, stepped forward with what might have passed for sympathy on a less calculating face. "Miss Whitmore, you must understand your position. You're alone, without protection or prospects. The last thing you need is to be seen as someone who associates with undesirable elements." Eleanor glanced down at William, who had pressed himself against her skirts, trying to make himself as small as possible. The fear in his young face made her decision for her. "I appreciate your concern, ladies," she said with more dignity than she felt. "But I'll decide for myself what constitutes proper behavior." Mrs. Abernathy's face flushed red. "Very well, Miss Whitmore. But don't expect the decent people of this town to come to your aid when your poor choices catch up with you." As the women stalked away, their whispered conversations carrying back on the morning breeze, Eleanor felt the weight of her isolation settle more heavily on her shoulders. She had just burned whatever small bridges might have remained to her in Dust Hollow society. The morning brought other challenges. Eleanor ventured into the town proper, with William trailing behind her like a wary shadow. hoping to find work or at least some temporary means of survival. The general store owner, Mr. Abernathy, took one look at her companion and firmly shook his head. "I got no work for women who can't conduct themselves properly," he declared, his eyes never leaving William's slight form. "And I won't have natives loitering around my establishment." The pattern repeated itself at the boarding house, the saloon, and even the church. Doors closed in Eleanor's face, sometimes literally, the moment people spotted William at her side. By midday, Eleanor's stomach was cramping with hunger, and she could see that William was struggling not to show his own desperate need for food. It was then that Silas Barrow approached them. Barrow was a man whose prosperity stood out like a sore thumb in the rough frontier town. His clothes were well-tailored, his boots polished, and his smile carried the oily confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. He owned the largest saloon in Dust Hollow, along with several other less reputable establishments that provided entertainment for the miners and cowboys who passed through town. "Miss Whitmore," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I hear you're in need of employment." Eleanor regarded him warily. She had heard enough whispers about Silas Barrow to know that his offers of help usually came with strings attached. "What sort of employment, Mr. Barrow?" "Oh, nothing unsuitable for a lady of your obvious refinement," he assured her, his smile widening to show gold teeth. "I'm in need of someone to manage the books for my various enterprises. Someone educated, someone who can read and write proper. The pay would be generous." Eleanor felt William tense beside her. Even the boy seemed to sense something unsavory about Barrow's offer. "And what exactly would my duties entail?" Barrow's eyes glittered. "Keeping track of accounts, managing correspondence, perhaps occasionally serving as a hostess when I entertain business associates. Nothing too taxing for someone of your obvious capabilities." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Eleanor understood exactly what sort of hostess duties Barrow had in mind, and the knowledge filled her with disgust. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Barrow, but I'll have to decline." Barrow's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "Now, Miss Whitmore, let's be practical. You have no money, no prospects, and no family to take you in. I'm offering you a chance to survive in comfort. Many women in your position would consider themselves fortunate to receive such an opportunity. Many women are not me," Eleanor replied firmly. Barrow's gaze shifted to William, and his expression grew calculating. "I see you've taken up with one of the local Apache strays. Interesting choice. But I should warn you, the good people of Dust Hollow don't take kindly to white women who, fraternize with the natives. It could make your situation even more precarious than it already is." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Barrow?" "Threatening? Heavens, no. I'm simply pointing out the realities of frontier life. A woman alone needs protection, Miss Whitmore, and I'm one of the few men in this town with the influence to provide it." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Think about it. My offer stands, for now." As Barrow sauntered away, Eleanor felt the net of her circumstances tightening around her. She was trapped between the moral disapproval of the respectable townspeople and the predatory interest of men like Barrow. And now William was caught in that trap with her, desperate for some small means of survival. Eleanor swallowed her pride and began asking for odd jobs, anything that might earn them a few coins or a meal. She was turned away from most places, but eventually found an elderly widow named Mrs. Patterson who was willing to pay a small sum for help with laundry. Eleanor spent the afternoon bent over a washboard behind Mrs. Patterson's small house, her hands growing red and raw in the harsh lye soap. William sat nearby, trying to make himself useful by sorting and folding the clean items. Mrs. Patterson watched them work with the sharp eyes of someone who had survived too many hard winters to be easily fooled. "You know, the old woman said as Eleanor hung the last of the washing on the line. "Most folks in town think you're making a mistake, taking up with that Apache boy." Eleanor's back stiffened. "Do you think I'm making a mistake, Mrs. Patterson?" The elderly woman was quiet for a long moment, studying William as he carefully folded a child's shirt. "I think that boy's been hurt enough for one lifetime," she said finally. "And I think maybe you're the first person to show him a lick of kindness in longer than he can remember." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected support. "He's just a child. How can people be so cruel?" Mrs. Patterson's weathered face grew sad. "Fear makes people cruel, child, and ignorance makes them stay that way. But that don't make it right." As the sun began to set, Eleanor and William made their way back toward the warehouse district. Eleanor had earned enough to buy them a small loaf of bread and a jar of preserves, luxury beyond measure given their circumstances. They found a sheltered spot near the creek that ran behind the town, where Eleanor could wash William's face and hands in the clear water. It was while she was helping him clean up that she noticed the extent of his injuries. Old bruises yellowed his ribs, and there were healing cuts on his arms that spoke of recent violence. Her heart ached as she realized how much suffering this small person had endured. "William," she said gently as she helped him into a clean shirt she had managed to purchase with her day's wages. "Where is your family? Your people?" The boy's face grew guarded. "Gone," he said simply. "Soldiers came. Many died. I ran." Eleanor felt the weight of history and tragedy in those simple words. This child had lost everything: family, home, safety, and was now surviving alone in a world that saw him as less than human. As they shared their meager meal in the gathering dusk, Eleanor made a decision that would define both their futures. She would not abandon this child, no matter what the cost to herself. They were both outcasts now, both unwanted by the society around them. But perhaps, together, they could create their own small sanctuary of kindness in this harsh and unforgiving land. "William," she said, as they prepared to settle down for another night in the wilderness, "I want you to know that as long as I draw breath, you will never be alone again." The boy looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. "Promise?" he whispered. "Promise," Eleanor replied, pulling him close as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the ridge above the creek, a young Apache warrior who had been tracking the lost child for days, his heart torn between duty to his people and amazement at the white woman's unexpected compassion toward one of his own. The Apache warrior had been watching them for 3 days. His name was Joseph Running Wolf, though he had been born with an Apache name that the white soldiers could never pronounce. He moved through the desert landscape like a shadow given form, his moccasined feet making no sound on the rocky terrain as he observed the strange white woman and the Apache child she had taken under her protection. Joseph had come to Dust Hollow following the trail of young William, whom he knew by his Apache name, Little Hawk. The boy was the son of Joseph's cousin, one of the many who had fallen when the cavalry had attacked their winter camp 6 months ago. Joseph had promised his dying cousin that he would find the boy and bring him back to what remained of their people. But what he had witnessed over the past few days had shaken something deep within his warrior's heart. Eleanor Whitmore was unlike any white woman he had ever encountered. She shared her meager food with the boy, protected him from the townspeople's cruelty, and spoke to him with a gentleness that Joseph had thought existed only among Apache mothers with their children. Most remarkably, she seemed to see William not as a savage or a burden, but as a precious child worthy of love and protection. On the 4th morning, as Eleanor and William made their way to the creek for their daily washing, Joseph made a decision that went against everything he had been taught about the White Eyes. He would reveal himself. Eleanor was helping William wash his face in the clear stream when a shadow fell across them. She looked up to see a tall, powerfully built Apache warrior standing on the bank above them, his long black hair adorned with a single eagle feather, his chest bare except for a beaded breastplate that caught the morning light. Her first instinct was to grab William and run, but something in the warrior's eyes stopped her. There was no hostility there, only a deep, searching intelligence that seemed to look straight into her soul. "You are the woman who cares for Little Hawk," he said in heavily accented but clear English. William's head snapped up at the Apache name, and Eleanor saw recognition dawn in the boy's eyes. "Cousin Joseph," William whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of joy and fear. The warrior's stern expression softened as he looked at the boy. "Yes, little one, I have come to take you home." Eleanor's heart clenched with a pain she hadn't expected. She had known this moment might come, but she wasn't prepared for how much the thought of losing William would hurt. Still, she forced herself to step back, releasing her protective hold on the boy. "Of course," she said quietly. "He should be with his people." But William surprised them both by clinging to Eleanor's skirts, shaking his head frantically. "No!" he cried in English, then switched to rapid Apache, speaking to Joseph in words Eleanor couldn't understand, but whose desperate tone she recognized all too well. Joseph's eyes widened as he listened to the boy's passionate plea. When William finished speaking, the warrior looked at Eleanor with something approaching wonder. "He says you are his new mother." Joseph said slowly, "He says you saved him from the bad white men, that you share your food even when you are hungry, that you hold him when the night terrors come." Eleanor felt tears threatening to spill. I only did what anyone would do." Joseph shook his head. "No, white woman. What you did is what few would do. I have watched you for days. I have seen how the people of your own kind treat you for showing kindness to an Apache child. Yet, still you protect him." The three of them stood in an awkward tableau by the creek, the morning sun climbing higher in the sky as each grappled with emotions too complex for simple words. "What is your name?" Joseph asked finally. "Eleanor Whitmore," she replied. "I am Joseph Running Wolf. Little Hawk, William. He is the son of my cousin, killed by blue soldiers last winter." Eleanor's heart ached at the pain she heard in his voice. "I'm sorry for your loss." Joseph studied her for a long moment. "You speak with truth, white woman. But I do not understand. Why do you care what happens to an Apache child?" Eleanor looked down at William, who was still pressed against her side, his small body trembling with the fear of being taken away from the only security he had known in months. "Because he's a child," she said simply. "Because he was alone and afraid, and no child should have to face that alone. Even an Apache child?" Joseph pressed. "Especially an Apache child," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. "He's lost everything, his family, his home, his people. If I can give him even a small measure of safety and love, how could I do otherwise?" Joseph was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to think he hadn't heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. "You risk much for him. The white people will not accept you if you keep an Apache child." Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "The white people don't accept me anyway. I'm a woman alone, without family or prospects. To them, I'm already an outcast." "Then you understand something of what it means to be Apache," Joseph observed. Eleanor was about to respond when the sound of approaching horses reached them. Joseph's hand immediately moved to the knife at his belt, his body coiling with tension. Eleanor instinctively pulled William closer as three riders appeared through the cottonwood trees that lined the creek. The riders were rough-looking men, the kind who made their living in ways that didn't bear close scrutiny. Their leader was a scarred man named Cletus Briggs, who had been eyeing Eleanor with unwelcome interest since her arrival in Dust Hollow. Well, Briggs drawled as he reined in his horse. "What do we have here? The fancy lady from back east? Consorting with savages now?" Eleanor felt Joseph tense beside her, but to her amazement, he didn't react to the insult. Instead, he seemed to be calculating, weighing options with the speed of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions in seconds. "You boys best move along," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're not bothering anyone." Briggs laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. "Oh, but you are bothering folks. Lady, see, decent people don't like to see white women taking up with redskins. Gives folks ideas. Makes them think maybe the natural order ain't so natural after all. The second rider, a younger man with cruel eyes, spoke up. Maybe we ought to teach both of them some manners. Cletus, show them what happens when they don't know their place. Eleanor's blood turned to ice as she realized the danger they were in. These men weren't just bigots. They were predators, looking for any excuse to unleash violence. It was then that Joseph spoke, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made all three riders pause. "You will leave now," he said simply, "or you will not leave at all." Briggs's face darkened with anger. "You threatening us, savage? There's 3 of us and 1 of you." Joseph's smile was sharp as a blade. "Then the odds are almost fair." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Eleanor could feel violence hanging in the air like the charge before a thunderstorm. William pressed closer to her, and she wrapped her arms around him protectively. Then, with movements so fluid they seemed like water, Joseph stepped forward. Eleanor didn't see exactly what happened. One moment the 3 riders were sitting their horses with confident sneers. The next moment 2 of them were on the ground, and Joseph had Briggs by the throat, lifting the larger man partly out of his saddle. "You will leave," Joseph repeated, his voice deadly calm. "You will not return. And if you or any others like you threaten this woman or this child again, you will answer to me." Briggs' face was turning purple, but he managed to nod frantically. Joseph released him, and the man fell back into his saddle, gasping for air. "This ain't over." Briggs wheezed as his companions scrambled to remount their horses. "Yes, it is," Joseph replied with finality that brooked no argument. The 3 men rode away at a gallop, their courage evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had never seen violence like that, swift, controlled, absolutely effective. Joseph had handled 3 armed men as easily as she might handle a difficult seam in her sewing. "Are you hurt?" Joseph asked, turning to her with concern. Eleanor shook her head, not trusting her voice. William looked up at Joseph with something approaching worship in his young eyes. "You saved us," the boy whispered in English. Joseph knelt down to William's level. "We protect our own," he said simply. Then he looked up at Eleanor. "All of our own." The implication of his words wasn't lost on Eleanor. Somehow, without her realizing it, she had crossed a line. In Joseph's eyes, she was no longer just a white woman who had shown kindness to an Apache child. She had become something more, someone worth protecting. "I cannot take Little Hawk from you," Joseph said after a long moment. "He has chosen you, and Apache children are allowed to choose their path when their heart speaks clearly." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "But he needs to be with his people, to learn his heritage. His people include you now," Joseph said quietly, "and I will make sure he learns what he needs to know." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked. Joseph stood. His decision made, "I will stay. I will watch over you both. Teach Little Hawk the ways of his father's people, and make sure no more men like those come to threaten you." Eleanor stared at him in amazement. "You would do that? Give up returning to your tribe?" Joseph's smile was sad but determined. "My tribe is scattered, hiding in the mountains, surviving from day to day. Here, I can do something worthwhile. I can protect a woman who has shown more courage and compassion than most warriors I have known." As they stood by the creek, the 3 of them forming an unlikely family born of necessity and mutual protection, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. For the first time since arriving in Dust Hollow, she felt truly safe. Not because she was no longer in danger. If anything, their situation was more precarious than ever, but because she was no longer alone in facing that danger. "Where will we live?" she asked practically. Joseph gestured toward the hills beyond the town. "There is a place I know, a canyon with water and shelter, far enough from town to be safe, close enough for you to find work if needed." Eleanor nodded, her decision made. "Then let's go home," she said, looking down at William with a smile. The boy's face lit up with joy, and he reached out to take both Eleanor's hand and Joseph's. linking them together. As they walked toward their uncertain but shared future, Eleanor couldn't help but think that sometimes the most unlikely families were the ones that mattered most. Behind them, the town of Dust Hollow continued its daily business, unaware that 3 lives had just become irrevocably intertwined, bound together by circumstances that would test their courage, their compassion, and their capacity for love in ways none of them could yet imagine. The canyon Joseph had spoken of lay hidden in the red rock formations 3 miles northeast of Dust Hollow, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound between towering stone walls. Eleanor followed Joseph and William through the winding passage, marveling at how the harsh desert landscape could suddenly give way to this sheltered oasis. A natural spring bubbled from the rocks at the canyon's heart, creating a small pool surrounded by cottonwood trees and patches of grass that seemed impossibly green after the browns and grays of the town. Ancient Apache petroglyphs decorated the canyon walls, telling stories and symbols that spoke of a time when this land belonged entirely to Joseph's people. "My grandfather's grandfather camped here," Joseph said as he set down the few supplies they had managed to gather. "The spring never runs dry, even in the worst drought years." Eleanor turned slowly, taking in their new home. It was beautiful, peaceful, and utterly isolated from the world that had rejected them both. "It's perfect," she whispered. Joseph had constructed a shelter against the canyon wall using fallen logs, brush, and pieces of canvas he had acquired through methods Eleanor didn't inquire about. It was crude but functional, large enough for all 3 of them, with a fire pit positioned to draw smoke up and out through a natural chimney in the rocks. The first few days in their hidden refuge were the most peaceful Eleanor had known since arriving in Arizona territory. She spent her mornings teaching William to read using the small Bible she carried in her carpet bag, while Joseph hunted rabbits and gathered edible plants from the desert. In the evenings, Joseph would tell stories in a mixture of English and Apache, teaching William about his heritage while Eleanor listened, fascinated by the rich oral tradition of his people. But it was the quiet moments between the 3 of them that Eleanor treasured most, watching Joseph patiently show William how to track animals, or seeing the way the stern warrior's face softened when the boy laughed. There was something deeply right about their makeshift family, something that filled the emptiness Eleanor had carried in her heart for longer than she cared to remember. On their 5th night in the canyon, a sudden thunderstorm struck with the violent intensity of the desert. Rain poured down in torrents, turning the normally dry creek bed into a rushing river. Lightning split the sky in brilliant white forks, and thunder echoed off the canyon walls like the voices of angry gods. Eleanor huddled with William in the shelter, both of them soaked despite Joseph's efforts to waterproof their makeshift home. The boy was terrified, clinging to Eleanor and whimpering with each crash of thunder. "Shh," Eleanor soothed, stroking his damp hair. "It's just a storm. It will pass." But William's fear went deeper than simple terror of the weather. The thunder reminded him of the sounds of cavalry guns, the lightning of muzzle flashes in the darkness. Eleanor could feel his small body trembling with memories too terrible for a child to bear. Joseph crouched beside them, his own clothes dripping with rainwater. "Little Hawk," he said gently in Apache, then switched to English. "The storm speaks, but it does not hunt us. We are safe here." "The soldiers," William whispered, his eyes wide with remembered terror. "The guns made noise like thunder." Mama fell down and wouldn't get up. Eleanor's heart broke for the child's pain. She pulled him closer, feeling Joseph's eyes on them both. "You're safe now," she murmured. "Both Joseph and I are here. We won't let anything happen to you." As the storm raged outside, the 3 of them drew closer together for warmth and comfort. Eleanor found herself acutely aware of Joseph's presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth radiating from his body, the way his dark eyes reflected the flickering firelight. "Tell me about your family," Eleanor said softly, hoping to distract both William and herself from the storm's fury. Joseph was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, His voice carried the weight of deep grief. "I had a wife once. Her name was Maria. She had learned the white man's name from the missionaries. She was like sunlight on water, always moving, always beautiful." His voice grew softer. "She died of the white man's sickness 3 winters ago. The fever took many of our people." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the pain in his voice. "I'm sorry?" Joseph nodded slowly. "She would have liked you. I think she always said that kindness was the strongest medicine, that it could heal wounds nothing else could touch." Their eyes met across the small space, and Eleanor felt something electric pass between them, an understanding that went beyond words. She became acutely aware that they were alone together, that William had finally fallen asleep between them, exhausted by his fears and soothed by their presence. "What about you?" Joseph asked quietly. "You came here to marry, but there must have been someone before, someone you cared for." Eleanor's laugh was soft and bitter. "There was a man back in Philadelphia, Thomas Hartwell. He was suitable. Our families thought we would make a good match." She paused, staring into the fire. "But when my father's business failed and we lost our money, Thomas discovered that his affections were not as deep as he had claimed. He married a banker's daughter 2 weeks before I left for Arizona. He was a fool," Joseph said simply. The certainty in his voice made Eleanor's cheeks warm. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the fierce warrior who had frightened off Briggs and his men, but the gentle soul who told bedtime stories to a traumatized child and spoke of his dead wife with such tenderness. "Joseph," she began, then stopped. Not sure what she wanted to say, he moved closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her cheek. His fingers were calloused from years of hard living, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "Eleanor," he said, her name sounding different in his deep voice, like a prayer or a promise. She should have pulled away. She knew that. Everything she had been taught about proper behavior, about the boundaries between races and cultures, screamed that this was wrong. But Eleanor had been cast out from that world of rules and expectations, here, in this hidden canyon with the storm raging overhead. None of those old constraints seemed to matter. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed as his thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. "I should not feel this way," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "You are not of my people, and you are not of mine." Eleanor whispered back, "But perhaps that doesn't matter as much as we were taught to believe." When their lips met, it was with the desperate hunger of 2 souls who had found something precious they had thought lost forever. Eleanor had been kissed before, chased pecks from suitable suitors that had left her feeling nothing but obligation. This was different. This was fire and need, and the overwhelming sense of coming home to a place she had never known she was searching for. Joseph's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and Eleanor melted into his embrace with a surrender that surprised her with its completeness. His lips moved against hers with increasing passion, and she responded with an ardor that would have shocked her civilized Philadelphia self. They broke apart only when the need for breath became overwhelming, both of them gasping in the flickering firelight. Joseph's eyes were dark with desire, but also with uncertainty. "Eleanor," he began, but she silenced him by placing her finger against his lips. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't think about what the world would say. Don't think about what's proper or expected. Just be here with me." Joseph caught her hand, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "You are sure?" Instead of answering with words, Eleanor reached up to cup his face in her hands, drawing him down for another kiss. This time, there was no hesitation, no holding back. They came together with the fierce need of 2 people who had found love in the most unlikely place, under the most impossible circumstances. Joseph's hands tangled in her hair as he deepened the kiss, and Eleanor felt herself responding to him in ways she had never imagined possible. Her body seemed to come alive under his touch, every nerve ending singing with new sensation. When they finally drew apart again, both breathing heavily, Eleanor rested her forehead against his. "I never knew," she whispered. "I never knew it could feel like this." "Nor I," Joseph admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Not since Maria died. I thought that part of my heart was buried with her. Eleanor looked into his eyes, seeing vulnerability there that he usually kept carefully hidden. Perhaps, she said softly, we can heal each other's wounded hearts. They held each other close as the storm gradually spent its fury outside their shelter. William slept peacefully between them, his small body finally relaxed and trusting. In the morning, Eleanor knew they would have to face the practical realities of their situation, 3 outcasts making a life together in a world that would condemn them for it. But for now, in the warm circle of firelight with the rain drumming softly on their roof, Eleanor felt something she had never experienced before. She felt truly, completely loved, not for what she could provide or what family she came from or how well she could manage a household, but for the person she was inside, flawed, brave, compassionate, and real, as sleep finally claimed her, curled safely in Joseph's arms with William nestled between them. Eleanor's last thought was that sometimes the most beautiful things grew in the most unlikely soil. Their love had been born from loss and desperation, but it was no less precious for its unconventional beginnings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new tests of their resolve, but they would face them together, bound by something stronger than the prejudices and expectations of the world outside their hidden canyon, bound by love freely given and gratefully received, by the fierce protective instincts of their chosen family, and by the quiet certainty that they had found something worth fighting for. The storm passed in the early hours of morning, leaving behind a world washed clean and shining with possibility. The rumors began to spread through Dust Hollow like wildfire in dry grass. It started with Mrs. Abernathy's sharp tongue at the weekly ladies' prayer circle, her voice dripping with moral outrage as she described what she claimed to have witnessed through her field glasses. That Whitmore woman, she declared to the assembled wives and spinsters, has taken up residence in the hills with that savage warrior, living in sin, bold as brass, with a heathen child to witness their depravity. The story grew with each telling, becoming more scandalous and inflammatory as it passed from mouth to mouth. By the time it reached Reverend Matthias Caldwell at the small wooden church on Main Street, Eleanor had become a fallen woman who had abandoned all Christian decency, while Joseph was transformed into a dangerous renegade, leading raids from his hidden stronghold. Silas Barrow listened to the gossip with calculating eyes, seeing opportunity in the town's mounting outrage. He had not forgotten Eleanor's rejection of his offer, and his wounded pride festered like an untreated wound. If the townspeople were ready to take action against the immoral union in the hills, he would be more than happy to lead the charge. Eleanor knew nothing of the gathering storm when she ventured into town 3 weeks after the night of the thunderstorm. She needed supplies, flour, salt, and medicine for William, who had developed a persistent cough. Joseph had argued against her going, sensing danger in the air like a wolf scenting a coming blizzard. But Eleanor had insisted. They needed the income from her occasional work with Mrs. Patterson. And besides, she reasoned, what could the townspeople really do to her that they hadn't already done? She should have listened to Joseph's warnings. Eleanor had barely set foot on Main Street when she sensed the change in the atmosphere. Conversations stopped when she passed, replaced by hostile stares and whispered comments. Children were pulled quickly to their mothers' sides, as if Eleanor carried some contagious disease. Even Mrs. Patterson, usually kind despite her gruff exterior, avoided Eleanor's eyes when she knocked on the woman's door. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore," the elderly woman said through the barely cracked door, "but I can't be seen associating with you anymore. Folks are saying, well, they're saying things that make it dangerous for me to have you around." Eleanor felt the first cold touch of real fear. "Mrs. Patterson, surely you don't believe—" "What I believe don't matter," the old woman interrupted sadly. "It's what they believe that'll get us both hurt. You best leave town. Child, today. Don't come back." The door closed with finality, leaving Eleanor standing alone on the dusty street with her heart pounding. She tried the general store, hoping to at least purchase the supplies they desperately needed. But Mr. Abernathy met her at the door with a shotgun across his arms. "We don't serve your kind here," he said coldly. "Not anymore." "My kind?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. "Women who consort with savages." Abernathy spat. "Women who forget their place and their Christian duty." Eleanor's temper flared. "My Christian duty? Was it not Christian to care for a hungry child, to show compassion to those who need it?" "That wasn't compassion," came a new voice. Reverend Caldwell approached, his usually gentle face hard with righteous anger. "That was the devil's work, leading you astray from the path of righteousness." A crowd was gathering. Eleanor realized with growing alarm. Men were emerging from the saloon. Women were coming out of the shops, all converging on her with expressions ranging from disgust to outright hatred. She looked for a friendly face and found none. Even those who might have been sympathetic seemed cowed by the mob's mood. "You've brought shame on every decent woman in this territory," Mrs. Abernathy declared, pushing to the front of the crowd. "Living unmarried with a heathen savage, corrupting an innocent child with your wicked ways." "William is safe and loved," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear rising in her throat. "Isn't that what matters?" "Safe?" Silas Barrow's oily voice cut through the crowd like a blade. "You call it safe to expose a child to the immoral practices of the Apache? To let him witness your unnatural relations?" Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The implications of his words were clear. They weren't just condemning her for living with Joseph. They were suggesting something far more sinister. "You don't understand," she began. But Barrow cut her off. "Oh, but we do understand. Miss Whitmore. We understand that you've forgotten your place as a Christian woman. We understand that you've chosen the way of the savage over the way of civilization. And we understand that something must be done about it." The crowd murmured agreement, and Eleanor saw several men fingering weapons, knives, guns, even farming implements that could be turned to violence. Her mouth went dry as she realized the full extent of the danger she was in. "What do you propose to do?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Reverend Caldwell stepped forward, his face set in lines of moral certainty. "We propose to save your soul from damnation, Miss Whitmore, to separate you from the evil influence that has led you astray, and to ensure that the child is raised in a proper Christian household. And if I refuse, then you'll face the consequences of your choices," Barrow said with a cold smile. "Desert justice has its own way of dealing with those who corrupt the natural order." Eleanor looked around at the circle of hostile faces and realized she was trapped. If she tried to run, they would catch her before she reached the edge of town. If she tried to fight, she would only make things worse for herself and for Joseph and William. It was then that a small voice cut through the tension like a knife. "She is my mother." Eleanor spun to see William running toward her, having somehow made his way into town despite Joseph's instructions to stay hidden. The boy flung himself against her, wrapping his thin arms around her waist with desperate strength. "She is my mother," he repeated in English, his young voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent crowd. "She saved me when I was hungry. She kept me warm when I was cold. She held me when the nightmares came. She is my mother." The crowd stared at the child in shock. Whatever they had expected, it wasn't this passionate declaration of love and loyalty from the very person they claimed Eleanor was corrupting. Mrs. Abernathy recovered first. "The child has been poisoned against his own people," she declared. "This only proves how thoroughly she's corrupted him." But something in William's simple words had reached some of the townspeople. Eleanor could see doubt creeping into a few faces, uncertainty replacing some of the righteous anger. It was at that moment that Joseph appeared. He materialized from the crowd like smoke given form, moving with the silent grace that allowed Apache warriors to strike without warning. One moment Eleanor was alone with William facing the mob. The next Joseph was beside them, his hand resting casually on the handle of his knife. "You will release them," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made several men step backward involuntarily. "Like hell we will," Barrow snarled, but Eleanor noticed he made no move to draw his own weapon. "This is between us and the woman. No concern of yours. Savage." Joseph's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Everything that concerns Eleanor concerns me. Everything that threatens William threatens me, and I am very concerned about threats." "There's only one of you and dozens of us," one of the younger men called out, trying to sound brave but failing to hide the tremor in his voice. "Yes," Joseph agreed mildly. "The odds are almost fair." Eleanor remembered the last time Joseph had faced multiple opponents and felt a flicker of hope. But this wasn't 3 drunken cowards. This was most of the adult population of Dust Hollow, and several of them were armed. "Please," she said, stepping forward. "This doesn't have to end in violence. We've done nothing wrong except try to make a family together. We've hurt no one, stolen nothing, caused no trouble for anyone. You've caused plenty of trouble." Barrow shot back. "You've set a bad example for other women, made people question the natural order of things. That kind of thinking spreads like a disease." Eleanor felt anger replace her fear. "The natural order? You mean the order where children starve in the streets while decent people look the other way? Where women are treated like property to be bought and sold? Where people are judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character?" "Enough." Reverend Caldwell's voice boomed across the square. "You will cease this blasphemous talk and submit to Christian authority. The child will be placed with a proper family. The savage will be turned over to the territorial marshal, and you will be sent back east where you belong." "And if we refuse?" Joseph asked, his voice deadly calm. The Reverend's face hardened. "Then may God have mercy on your souls, because this town will have none." Eleanor felt the situation spinning out of control. Violence was coming. She could feel it in the air like the charge before a lightning strike. Men were checking their weapons, women were backing away to safety, and the circle around them was tightening like a noose. It was then that William spoke again, his young voice cutting through the tension with unexpected power. "If justice is silence before kindness," he said carefully, repeating words Joseph had taught him in Apache but translating them into English, "then none of you deserve to be called human." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Eleanor saw several faces flush with shame, while others grew darker with anger. The town stood balanced on the edge of violence, waiting for someone to make the first move that would send them all tumbling into chaos. Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of cowering or pleading, she straightened her spine and looked directly into the eyes of her accusers. "You want to judge me?" she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "Then judge me by my actions. I took in a starving child and gave him love. I found a good man and chose to build a life with him. I've worked honestly, hurt no one, and tried to live by the principles I was taught: compassion, charity, and love for all God's children." She paused, letting her words sink in. "If those actions make me a sinner in your eyes, then I am proud to be counted among the sinners rather than the saints of Dust Hollow." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, could feel Joseph's tension beside her, could sense William trembling against her side. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, came the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. The applause came from Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's physician, a man whose weathered hands had delivered half the children in Dust Hollow and closed the eyes of just as many. He stepped forward from the crowd, his gray beard and kind eyes marking him as one of the few people in town who commanded universal respect. "Well said, Miss Whitmore." "Doctor," Hayes announced, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned square. "I've lived in this territory for 30 years, and I've seen plenty of sin. But caring for a child and finding love where you can, that's not sin, that's grace." Reverend Caldwell's face flushed red. "Dr. Hayes, surely you cannot condone—" "I can condone common human decency," the doctor interrupted firmly, "which seems to be in short supply here today." He looked around at the crowd with the disappointment etched in every line of his face. "I'm ashamed of you all. This woman has done nothing but show kindness, and you repay her with threats and violence." The crowd began to murmur, some voices supporting the doctor, others arguing against him. Eleanor felt a flicker of hope as she saw the mob's unity beginning to crack. But Silas Barrow was not about to let his moment of reckoning slip away so easily. "The good doctor speaks of kindness," Barrow said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to swaying crowds. "But what of the kindness we owe to our own children? What happens when they see that there are no consequences for abandoning Christian morality? What happens when other women decide to follow Miss Whitmore's example?" A woman in the crowd called out, "My daughter's been asking questions since this all started, wondering why she has to marry who her father chooses if that woman can live free with whoever she wants." And that's exactly the problem, Barrow continued, seizing on the comment. "This isn't just about one fallen woman. This is about the very fabric of our society. If we allow this to continue, where does it end? Do we let our daughters run wild? Do we let savages think they can take white women without consequence?" Eleanor saw Joseph's jaw tighten at the slur, but he remained motionless, calculating. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, trying to convey that violence would only prove Barrow's point. "Mr. Barrow," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "No one has taken anyone. I made my choice freely. I chose love over convention, family over social standing. If that threatens your way of life, perhaps you should ask yourself why." "Because civilization requires order," Barrow shot back. "It requires people to know their place, to follow rules, to turn away from hungry children," Eleanor interrupted, "to let fear overcome compassion, to judge people by their birth rather than their character." "Doctor," Hayes stepped closer to Eleanor, positioning himself between her and the more hostile members of the crowd. "The lady has a point. When did we become so afraid of kindness that we'd rather destroy it than learn from it?" But Mrs. Abernathy was not swayed. "Doctor, you're a bachelor. You don't understand what it means to raise children in a world where moral standards are crumbling. This woman's actions affect us all." "Do they?" came another voice from the crowd. Eleanor turned to see Mrs. Patterson pushing forward, her weathered face set with determination. "Or do they simply remind us how narrow our own hearts have become?" Eleanor stared in amazement at the elderly woman who had turned her away just an hour before. "Mrs. Patterson," she whispered. The old woman nodded grimly. "I've been thinking since you left my door, child. Thinking about what kind of woman turns away someone in need out of fear of what the neighbors might say. And I don't like the answer I came up with." The crowd was becoming increasingly divided now. Some nodded in agreement with Mrs. Patterson and Dr. Hayes, while others grew more agitated, sensing that their righteous cause was slipping away from them. It was then that Reverend Caldwell played his final card. "Perhaps," he said, his voice carrying the weight of religious authority, "we should let the law decide. The territorial marshal is due to arrive next week for his monthly circuit. Let him determine whether these arrangements are legal under territorial law." Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice. She knew enough about territorial law to understand that her situation with Joseph would not be recognized as legal marriage, and that William's custody could easily be transferred to a proper Christian family. Joseph must have understood the threat as well, because Eleanor felt him tense beside her like a coiled spring. But before anyone could respond to the Reverend's suggestion, a new voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary." All eyes turned to see a tall, lean man in a dusty coat and worn boots walking into the square. The silver star pinned to his vest identified him as Marshal Tom Bridger, the territorial law officer who maintained order across hundreds of square miles of Arizona territory. Eleanor's heart sank. The marshal had arrived early, and with him came the full weight of territorial law that she knew would not be on their side. Marshal Bridger surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had broken up more than his share of lynch mobs. His gaze lingered on Joseph, taking in the warrior's calm stance and the hand that rested near his knife. then moved to Eleanor and William, noting the protective way she held the boy against her side. "Reverend Caldwell," the marshal said, tipping his hat slightly. "Might I ask, what's got the whole town gathered in the street?" Before the Reverend could answer, Silas Barrow stepped forward eagerly. "Marshal, we've got a situation here that requires legal intervention. This woman has been living in an immoral arrangement with an Apache warrior, corrupting a native child in the process." Marshal Bridger's expression remained neutral. "That's so. And what exactly makes it immoral, Mr. Barrow?" Barrow sputtered. "Well, they're not married, not properly married, anyway, and she's white. He's Apache." "Last I checked," the marshal interrupted mildly, "territorial law doesn't prohibit cohabitation between consenting adults. And as for racial mixing, well, that's more a matter of social custom than legal statute." Eleanor felt a flutter of hope. Perhaps the law would be more flexible than she had feared. But Barrow wasn't finished. "What about the child? Marshal? Surely you can see that an Apache boy shouldn't be raised by an unmarried white woman and a savage warrior." Marshal Bridger turned his attention to William, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the intensity of someone whose fate hung in the balance. "Boy," the marshal said gently, kneeling down to William's level. "What's your name?" "William," the boy replied clearly. "William Running Wolf." Eleanor blinked in surprise. The boy had never used Joseph's surname before, but somehow he understood the importance of claiming that connection now. "And who takes care of you, William?" The boy looked up at Eleanor with absolute certainty. "My mother, Eleanor, and my father, Joseph. They keep me safe and teach me good things and love me very much." Marshal Bridger nodded thoughtfully. "You look healthy and well cared for, son. Are you happy with your family?" "Yes, sir," William replied without hesitation. "They saved me when I was hungry and scared. They are my family now." The marshal stood, his decision clearly forming. Eleanor held her breath, knowing that the next words would determine all their fates. "Mr. Barrow, Reverend Caldwell," Marshal Bridger said formally. "I see no evidence of criminal activity here. The child appears healthy and well cared for, and while their arrangement may be unconventional, it's not illegal under territorial law." Barrow's face grew red with anger. "But Marshal—" "However," Bridger continued, raising a hand for silence, "the question of the child's legal status is more complex. If he has surviving relatives among the Apache, they would have legitimate claim to custody." Eleanor's heart began to pound. She looked at Joseph, seeing her own fear reflected in his dark eyes. The marshal turned to Joseph. "I assume you're the Apache warrior in question. I am Joseph Running Wolf." Joseph replied with dignity. "And what is your relationship to the boy?" "He is the son of my cousin, killed by cavalry soldiers. I came to find him and bring him back to our people." "But you chose not to do so?" Joseph glanced at Eleanor, then back at the marshal. "The boy had found a mother who loved him. Among my people, we believe children should be allowed to choose their path when their heart speaks clearly." Marshal Bridger nodded slowly. "A wise philosophy. And your relationship with Miss Whitmore?" Eleanor held her breath, waiting for Joseph's answer. "She is my woman," Joseph said simply, "and I am her man. In the eyes of my people and in our own hearts, we are married. Even though no legal ceremony has been performed, the spirits know our commitment." Joseph replied, "Papers do not make love real or false." Marshal Bridger was quiet for a long moment. Considering, Eleanor could feel the tension in the crowd, could sense that everything balanced on the marshal's next words. "Well," he said finally, "it seems to me that this is a family matter, not a legal one. The boy is cared for by people who love him. You're all living peacefully and bothering no one. And while your arrangement may be unconventional, it's not criminal." Eleanor felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. But the marshal wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "I can see that your presence here is causing significant tension in the community. For everyone's safety, yours and the town's, I strongly suggest you consider relocating somewhere your family arrangement won't be such a source of conflict. It wasn't the complete vindication Eleanor had hoped for, but it was reprieve. They were free to go, free to build their life together somewhere else. Silas Barrow wasn't ready to accept defeat. Marshall, surely you can see the danger of setting such a precedent. The only danger I see, Mr. Barrow, Marshal Bridger said sharply, is a mob preparing to take the law into their own hands. I suggest everyone return to their business and let this family make their own decisions about their future. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some people grumbling about legal technicalities, while others seemed relieved that the confrontation had ended without violence. Eleanor found herself standing in the gradually emptying square with Joseph and William, free but forever changed by what had transpired. Doctor. Hayes approached them as the last of the crowd melted away. Miss Whitmore, I want you to know that not everyone in this town shares the attitudes you encountered today. If you ever need medical care, for yourself or your family, you'll always be welcome at my practice. Eleanor felt tears threaten again at his kindness. Thank you, Doctor. Your support meant more than you know. Mrs. Patterson was the last to approach, pressing a small bundle into Eleanor's hands. Supplies, she said gruffly. Medicine for the boy's cough. Some food for the journey. Wherever you go, I hope you find the peace you deserve. As the three of them walked out of Dust Hollow for what they all knew would be the last time, Eleanor felt the weight of the day's events settling on her shoulders. They had survived, but at the cost of any hope of building a normal life in this place. William slipped his hand into hers as they reached the edge of town. Are we going home now? He asked. Eleanor looked back at the town that had rejected them, then ahead to the vast desert that held both danger and possibility. Yes, she said softly. We're going home. But first, she knew they would need to find where home was for a family like theirs, bound not by law or convention, but by love freely given and fiercely protected against a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. The decision came to Eleanor 3 weeks after their confrontation with the town, as she watched Joseph teaching William to weave grass into baskets by the flickering light of their campfire. The sight of her chosen family, peaceful and content despite the world's rejection, filled her with a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. I want to marry you, she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. Joseph looked up from the half-finished basket in his hands, his dark eyes searching her face in the firelight. We are already married in the ways that matter. Eleanor, the spirits know our bond. But I want more than that, Eleanor insisted, moving closer to where he sat. I want to stand before your people and make vows that they can witness. I want William to see that we're committed to each other and to him, not just by necessity, but by choice. William looked up from his own clumsy attempt at basket weaving. Like a real wedding? With ceremonies and everything? Eleanor smiled at the excitement in the boy's voice. Yes, exactly like that. If your father's people will have us. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor felt a flutter of uncertainty. Perhaps she had presumed too much, assumed feelings that weren't reciprocated. My people are scattered, Joseph said finally, his voice thoughtful. Many hide in the high country, moving from place to place to avoid the soldiers. But there is a settlement, 3 days' ride north of here. My uncle, Grey Wolf, leads a small band of families who have managed to stay together. Would they accept me? Eleanor asked, then added more quietly, would they accept us? Joseph reached out to take her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Grey Wolf is a wise man. He judges people by their actions, not their skin. And what you have done for Little Hawk, for William, that speaks louder than any words. Then let's go to them, Eleanor said with growing conviction. Let's make this official in the eyes of your people, in the eyes of God, in the eyes of anyone who cares to witness it. William bounced with excitement. Can I be part of the ceremony? In Apache weddings? Do children get to help? Joseph's smile was warm as he looked at the boy who had become his son in all but blood. In Apache tradition, the whole community participates in a wedding. Children, elders, everyone. You would have an important role, Little Hawk. And so, 2 days later, they began their journey into the mountains. Eleanor had sewn herself a simple dress from the soft doeskin that Joseph had acquired through trading, working by lamplight to create something appropriate for an Apache wedding ceremony. It was unlike anything she had ever worn, supple and comfortable, decorated with small shells and beads that William had helped her collect from the desert. The trail into the high country was treacherous, winding through narrow canyons and steep mountain passes that seemed to lead nowhere. Eleanor had never been comfortable on horseback, but the sturdy pony Joseph had found for her was patient with her inexperience. William rode behind Joseph on his larger horse, chattering excitedly about the ceremony to come and pointing out landmarks that Joseph patiently identified. On the second day of their journey, they encountered the sentries. Eleanor didn't see them until they stepped out from behind the rocks where they had been concealed, but Joseph had been aware of their presence for miles. 3 Apache warriors, their faces painted with ceremonial designs, blocked the narrow trail ahead. Joseph Running Wolf, the eldest of the 3, called out in Apache, then switched to heavily accented English for Eleanor's benefit. "You return to us, but you bring strangers." "I bring family," Joseph replied firmly, dismounting from his horse. "This is Eleanor, who will be my wife, and this is Little Hawk, son of my cousin who fell at Red Creek." The warrior's eyes widened as he recognized William. "Little Hawk, we thought you were dead with your parents." William slid down from the horse and ran to the warrior, who caught him in a fierce embrace. Eleanor watched with tears in her eyes as the man spoke rapidly in Apache, clearly expressing his joy at finding the boy alive. When the emotional reunion finally ended, the warrior turned his attention to Eleanor. His examination was thorough but not unkind, taking in her Apache-style dress, her weathered hands that spoke of hard work, and most importantly, the way she looked at William with obvious maternal love. "She has cared for Little Hawk," the warrior observed to Joseph. "She saved his life," Joseph replied. "She chose him when her own people rejected her for it. She is worthy of our protection." The warrior nodded slowly. "Gray Wolf will want to hear this story. Come, they are camped in the sacred valley." The Apache settlement was hidden in a valley so remote that Eleanor marveled that anyone could find it without Apache guides. Perhaps 30 people lived here, men, women, children, and elders who had managed to escape the reservations and maintain something of their traditional way of life. Gray Wolf was ancient, his hair white as winter snow, his face carved by decades of desert wind and mountain cold. But his eyes were sharp as a hawk's as he studied Eleanor, missing nothing in his assessment of this white woman who sought to join their people. "Joseph Running Wolf," he said in English that was far more fluent than Eleanor had expected. "You bring us a mystery, a white woman who would marry into our tribe, who has cared for our lost child. Speak, and let us understand." Joseph told their story from the beginning: Eleanor's abandonment at the train station, her protection of William, their growing love, and the town's rejection of their unconventional family. Gray Wolf listened without interruption, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. When Joseph finished, Gray Wolf turned his attention to William. "Little Hawk, speak truthfully. How has this woman treated you?" William straightened his small shoulders, understanding the importance of this moment. "She found me when I was hungry and scared. She shared her food when she had little. She held me when the nightmares came. She protected me when the bad men wanted to hurt me." His voice grew stronger with each word. "She became my mother when I had no one else. And you, white woman," Gray Wolf said, fixing Eleanor with his penetrating gaze. "Why do you wish to join a people who are hunted, who live in hiding, who can offer you none of the comforts of your former life?" Eleanor had prepared for this question during their long journey, but standing before this wise elder, she found that elaborate explanations fell away, leaving only simple truth. "Because they are my family now," she said quietly. "Because love isn't about comfort or safety, or what others think is proper. It's about choosing to stand with people who matter to you, no matter what the cost. Grey Wolf was silent for so long that Eleanor began to worry she had somehow failed his test. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of ritual and ceremony. Among our people, marriage is not just between two individuals. It is the joining of hearts, the blending of spirits, the creation of family that extends beyond blood to encompass choice and commitment. He paused, studying both Eleanor and Joseph. But such a union must be witnessed by the spirits, blessed by the community, and sealed by sacred ceremony. Eleanor felt her heart skip. Are you saying? I am saying that if you truly wish to become Apache, to take on the responsibilities and joys of our people, then we will welcome you with a full ceremony of marriage. But understand, once you take these vows, you cannot undo them. You will be Apache in the eyes of our people, committed to our ways, bound to our fate. Eleanor looked at Joseph, seeing her own determination reflected in his dark eyes. Then she looked at William, who was practically vibrating with excitement. I understand, she said firmly, and I accept. The wedding preparations began immediately. The Apache women took Eleanor under their care, teaching her the rituals she would need to know, helping her perfect her ceremonial dress, and sharing the traditions that would make her truly one of their people. Morning Star, Grey Wolf's daughter, became Eleanor's guide through the complex ceremony. Apache marriage is different from white marriage, she explained as she helped Eleanor arrange her hair with traditional ornaments. We believe that husband and wife are equal partners, that both must be strong for the family to survive. What will be expected of me? Eleanor asked. To be Joseph's companion, not his servant, to help provide for the family, to teach the children, tend the sick, contribute to the survival of our people. Morning Star paused in her work. And to love Little Hawk as your own son, which I think you already do. The ceremony itself took place at sunset 3 days later, with the entire community gathered in a circle around Eleanor and Joseph. Eleanor's heart pounded as she stood beside the man she loved, wearing her doeskin dress and traditional jewelry, feeling more beautiful and more herself than she ever had in her life. Grey Wolf began the ceremony with prayers in Apache, calling on the spirits to bless the union. Then he switched to English, ensuring that Eleanor understood every word of the vows she was taking. Eleanor Whitmore, he said solemnly, do you come freely to this ceremony, understanding that you are choosing not just a husband, but a people, a way of life, a destiny that may bring hardship as well as joy? I do, Eleanor replied, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered community. Joseph Running Wolf, do you accept this woman as your wife, your partner in all things, your companion in whatever trials may come? I do, Joseph said, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. Grey Wolf nodded and continued with the traditional Apache wedding ceremony. Eleanor and Joseph drank from the same cup, symbolizing their willingness to share whatever life brought them. They exchanged gifts, Eleanor giving Joseph a shirt she had sewn with her own hands, Joseph presenting Eleanor with a necklace of silver and turquoise that had belonged to his grandmother. But the most meaningful moment came when William stepped forward, carrying a small bundle of sweetgrass that he had gathered himself. In Apache tradition, Grey Wolf explained, the children of the community help to bless the marriage by offering gifts that represent the future. He smiled at William. Little Hawk, present your gift. William approached Eleanor and Joseph with solemn dignity. This sweetgrass will burn clean and smell good in your home, he said carefully, having obviously practiced the words, like the love in our family. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she accepted the gift. In that moment, surrounded by people who had welcomed her despite her differences, united to the man she loved by bonds deeper than law or custom, she felt a completion she had never known was possible. As the sun set behind the mountains and the celebration continued into the night, Eleanor danced with her new family, laughed with the women who were now her sisters, and watched William playing with the other Apache children as if he had never known any other life. When she and Joseph finally withdrew to the small dwelling that had been prepared for them, Eleanor felt as if she was truly coming home for the first time in her life. "No regrets?" Joseph asked as they sat together in the quiet intimacy of their wedding night. Eleanor looked around at their simple but comfortable home, thought of the community that had embraced her, remembered the joy on William's face during the ceremony. "None," she said firmly. "This is where I belong. This is who I was meant to be." As Joseph drew her into his arms, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her from the abandoned train platform in Dust Hollow to this moment of perfect belonging. She had lost the life she had planned, but she had found something infinitely more precious, a love that transcended all boundaries, a family bound not by obligation but by choice, and a home that existed wherever the three of them were together. Outside their dwelling, the Apache settlement slept peacefully under the stars, confident in the ancient rhythms of their life. Eleanor Running Wolf, for that was her name now, fell asleep in her husband's arms, dreaming of the future they would build together, whatever challenges it might bring, for 3 blissful months. Eleanor lived in the hidden Apache settlement as if the outside world had ceased to exist. She learned to grind corn with the traditional meditate, to weave baskets that were both beautiful and functional, and to identify the desert plants that could heal or harm. William thrived among the Apache children, his nightmares fading as he reclaimed his heritage while holding on to the love that had saved him. Joseph taught Eleanor to read the desert's moods, to find water in places that looked barren, and to move through the landscape without leaving traces that soldiers could follow. In return, she taught several of the Apache children to read and write English, skills that Grey Wolf recognized would be necessary for survival in the changing world. Their happiness seemed complete, built on love and acceptance in a place where their unconventional family was not just tolerated but celebrated. Eleanor had never imagined such contentment was possible, but the outside world had not forgotten about them. Samuel Morrison arrived at the territorial capital in Tucson on a cold December morning, his boots polished and his suit pressed despite the long journey from California. The man who had abandoned Eleanor at the train station in Dust Hollow had prospered in his new life, making a fortune in mining operations along the Mexican border. But guilt and wounded pride had festered in his heart like an infection. Growing stronger with each successful business deal, Morrison had convinced himself that Eleanor's rejection of civilization was a direct affront to his honor. In his version of events, he had been unavoidably delayed, and Eleanor had chosen to consort with savages rather than wait for a proper Christian gentleman. The fact that she now lived as the wife of an Apache warrior was, in his mind, the ultimate insult to everything he represented. He spent 2 days in Tucson, meeting with territorial officials and carefully laying the groundwork for his campaign. Morrison was a persuasive man when he chose to be, and he painted a compelling picture of a white woman who had been corrupted by Apache influences, possibly held against her will, certainly in need of rescue by proper Christian authority. "Gentlemen," he addressed the territorial judge and the local military commander over dinner at Tucson's finest hotel. "We cannot allow such outrages to continue. What message does it send to other women if we permit one of our own to live in savage degradation? What does it say about our commitment to Christian civilization?" Judge Harold Whitcomb was an ambitious man who saw opportunity in Morrison's crusade. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Morrison. The territorial government cannot be seen as weak on matters of moral authority. If this woman has been taken by Apaches, she goes willingly now," Morrison admitted. "But who can say what coercion brought her to that state, what threats against the child she protects? We must consider that her initial choice was made under duress." Colonel James Carleton, commander of the local cavalry unit, leaned forward with interest. "And you say you can identify the exact location of this Apache band?" Morrison nodded confidently. "My sources are very reliable. The band is led by an old man called Grey Wolf, hiding in the mountains north of Dust Hollow. They've been evading your patrols for months." "Then it's our duty to act," Judge Whitcomb declared. "I'll issue the necessary warrants. rescue the woman, arrest the Apache warriors, and bring that child back to proper Christian upbringing. And if the woman resists rescue? Colonel Carlton asked. Morrison's smile was cold. Then we save her from her own misguided choices. A woman living in such circumstances cannot be considered capable of rational judgment. The legal machinery ground into motion with frightening efficiency. Within a week, Morrison had obtained court orders declaring Eleanor to be living under unnatural and coercive circumstances that invalidated any choices she might make. The orders granted him, as her intended husband, legal authority over her person, and placed William under territorial custody pending placement with a proper Christian family. The military escort that accompanied Morrison into the mountains was led by Lieutenant Daniel Crawford, a young officer ambitious for promotion and convinced that rescuing white women from Apache captivity would advance his career. 20 seasoned cavalrymen followed him, armed with the latest Spencer repeating rifles and the absolute certainty that they represented civilization's triumph over savagery. Eleanor was teaching a group of Apache children their English letters when the lookouts brought word that soldiers were approaching the valley. The peaceful afternoon shattered like glass as Grey Wolf called for immediate evacuation. Take only what you must carry, Joseph urged Eleanor as she frantically gathered their few possessions. We have perhaps an hour before they find the main trail. But why are they here? Eleanor asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. How did they find us? Someone told them where to look, Grey Wolf said grimly as he helped the elderly and children prepare for flight. Someone with a grudge. The evacuation proceeded with the practiced efficiency of a people who had learned that survival depended on mobility. Within minutes, the Apache families were melting into the mountains through hidden trails, carrying their lives on their backs. Eleanor, Joseph, and William were among the last to leave, ensuring that no evidence of their presence would guide the soldiers to their people's new hiding place. But as they reached the valley's rim, the sound of approaching horses told them they were too late. Mrs. Eleanor Running Wolf, the amplified voice echoed off the canyon walls, formal and implacable. This is Lieutenant Crawford of the United States Cavalry. By order of the Territorial Court, you and the minor child William are to be taken into protective custody immediately. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. They had found not just the Apache band, but her specifically. Someone had given them detailed information. You will surrender yourself and the child for immediate transport to Tucson, where proper arrangements will be made for your care and the child's placement with a Christian family. Never, Eleanor whispered. But even as she spoke, she could see the futility of their situation. The soldiers had positioned themselves to cut off the main escape routes, and their superior firepower made resistance impossible. Joseph took her hand, his eyes dark with the same hopeless rage she felt burning in her own chest. We can fight, he said quietly. And get our people killed for nothing? Eleanor replied, her voice breaking. No, Joseph, I won't have their blood on my hands. William pressed close to Eleanor's side, his young face pale with fear but determined. I won't go with them, he declared in his clear voice. You are my mother. Joseph is my father. We are family. Eleanor knelt down to his level, tears streaming down her face. Sometimes, sweetheart, we have to be brave in ways we never expected. Sometimes we have to fight battles in places we don't want to be. What do you mean? William asked, though Eleanor could see he already understood. I mean, I'm going to go with them. I'm going to face their courts and their judges, and I'm going to tell them the truth about our family. I'm going to make them understand that love doesn't recognize the color of skin or the customs of birth. Joseph gripped her hand tighter. Eleanor, you don't know what they'll do to you. These are not the reasonable people we faced in Dust Hollow. Then I'll make them reasonable, Eleanor said with fierce determination. I'll stand in their courtroom and tell our story until they have no choice but to listen. And if they refuse to listen? Joseph asked. Eleanor stood, her decision made. Then at least William will know that someone fought for him, that someone believed our family was worth defending. The surrender was accomplished with painful dignity. Eleanor walked down into the valley with her head high, William's hand in hers, refusing to show the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Joseph accompanied them to the valley floor, where Lieutenant Crawford waited with barely concealed impatience. "Mrs. Whitmore," Crawford began, but Eleanor cut him off. "Mrs. Running Wolf," she corrected firmly. "I am legally married under Apache law, recognized by the territorial government in previous cases." Crawford's face flushed. "Ma'am, whatever ceremony you may have undergone with these people has no legal standing. You are Eleanor Whitmore, and you are under the protection of the United States government." "I need no protection from my own family," Eleanor replied coldly. It was then that Samuel Morrison emerged from behind the line of soldiers. His well-tailored suit and confident smile, a jarring contrast to the harsh mountain setting. Eleanor stared at the man who had abandoned her at the train station 9 months ago, the man whose betrayal had set in motion everything that followed. "Hello, Eleanor," Morrison said with false warmth. "I've come to take you home." "You have no home to offer me," Eleanor replied with ice in her voice. "You forfeited any claim to me when you chose another woman over your obligations." Morrison's smile never wavered. "I understand your bitterness, my dear. Living in such circumstances must have affected your judgment. But that's all in the past now. I'm prepared to honor our original agreement. I am already married to a good man who loves me." "You are confused," Morrison said with patronizing gentleness. "Living among savages has clouded your thinking, but proper medical care and time away from these influences will restore your natural reason." Eleanor felt rage building in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. Losing her temper now would only play into their hands. "Lieutenant Crawford," she said formally, "I invoke my right as a citizen to contest these proceedings before a proper court. I demand legal representation and a full hearing of the facts." Crawford looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, my orders are to escort you to Tucson for your own protection." "Then escort me," Eleanor said with quiet dignity. "But know that I go under protest, as a free citizen wrongfully detained, and I will use every legal means at my disposal to return to my family." As they rode out of the valley under military escort, Eleanor looked back once at the mountains that had sheltered her brief but perfect happiness. Joseph rode behind them until they reached the territorial boundary, his presence a silent promise that their separation was not the end of their story. At the boundary, he was forced to stop, but his voice carried clearly to Eleanor as she was led away. "I will wait for you," he called. "However long it takes, wherever you must go, I will wait." Eleanor turned in her saddle, her heart breaking and mending simultaneously. "And I will return to you," she called back. "Nothing they can do will change what we are to each other." William clung to her as they rode toward Tucson and an uncertain future, but Eleanor felt a strange peace settling over her. She had found her strength in the desert, discovered her courage in love, and learned that some bonds could not be broken by law or custom or fear. The real battle was about to begin, not with weapons or violence, but with words and truth, and the fierce determination of a woman who had finally learned who she was meant to be. Eleanor Running Wolf rode toward her confrontation with civilization, ready to fight for her family with every weapon love had given her. The territorial court of Tucson was about to discover what happened when they tried to separate a mother from her child, a wife from her husband, and a soul from the place where it had finally found home. As the sun set behind them and the lights of Tucson appeared ahead, Eleanor whispered a promise into the desert wind. "I will hold you until the night ends, my darling boy. And this night will end." Thank you for listening to this tale of love, courage, and family forged in the harsh beauty of the American frontier. If you enjoyed Eleanor, Joseph, and William's story, please let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow travelers around our virtual campfire. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of love and adventure from the untamed frontier. And share your thoughts about Eleanor's journey with our community of storytelling enthusiasts.